Hello, my fellow Plutonians, and welcome back to my channel. First, I want to start off by thanking everyone for the positive feedback with regards to my brand new podcast. It's still very early days. I've literally only shared it a few hours ago, but so far so good. And I just wanted to let you know that your support is very much appreciated, and Zach appreciates it too. If you have tuned into my podcast, then you will know that I promised you this very video, looking into the Court of Appeal's judgment in a more legal and detailed way. I will warn you that the judgment is very short and you'll find this description very familiar. A bit devoid of any legal reasoning per se. It's an echo of what the judges voiced during the actual live hearing, if you watched it. If you didn't watch it, I did summarize it in a previous video, which will be linked down in the description box. So if you've watched my podcast, then you'll know that I pointed out a number of issues that I personally had with the Court of Appeal's judgment. So you know by now that, of course, my overall opinion on this judgment is that it's very confusing. And while I understand that courts of appeal in general are very reluctant to interfere with findings of fact that are made by a trial judge, there are still exceptional circumstances, as I said during the podcast. And I even brought up the Serafin case that we talked about last year. And I really do still think that that case is on par with Johnny's, or vice versa. Johnny's case is exceptional as the Serafin case was, which was riddled with errors in the fact-finding phase, not errors of law. And the appeal was still granted. And you may have also heard me talk about how I saw this coming. I did watch the appeal hearing live, and from the questions that were being posed by the judges, I could tell that they just weren't buying it. I just didn't want to say it out loud because I was hoping I was wrong, and I didn't want to cause people to get angry and upset before having a legitimate reason to feel that way. All right, for starters, if you don't know what the appeal arguments are, I have made a couple of videos addressing them. So once again, they will be linked in the description box. One of them deals with the appeal, and the second video talks about how they want to adduce new evidence of Amber's failure to donate to the charities that she promised she would donate her $7 million settlement to. So the appeal hearing involved both of these applications, and Johnny failed on both counts. I want to first start off by clarifying why courts of appeal don't like to interfere in findings of fact. And they actually also bring this up in the judgment itself. Essentially, it's because the trial judge has the advantage of having access to all of the evidence, and not only that, but also to hearing the witnesses testify and being in the same room with them and watching their body language. All of these first-hand experiences that a court of appeal wouldn't have. Courts of appeal are limited to transcripts. They do not accept oral evidence. There may be exceptional circumstances in the UK, I'm not too sure. But as a general rule, no witnesses provide any testimony. It's all based on what happened during the trial. So courts of appeal don't want to duplicate that by undermining everything the trial judge had access to and doing it all over again at the appeal stage. It's just a waste of time and resources. It is understandable for the most part, but exceptional circumstances always exist. And allowance is made for these circumstances by the law. And again, I'll point you to the Serafin case as a prime example of one of these exceptional circumstances in real life. So the central issue here, which is acknowledged by the Court of Appeal, is the entirety of Johnny's appeal is based on the fact that Mr. Justice Nicol committed various errors in the fact-finding phase. It wasn't necessarily a misapplication of the law, although that was a component as well. It definitely wasn't the main reason for the appeal. And again, because we've talked about this extensively, I won't be rehashing how Mr. Justice Nicol committed errors in the fact-finding phase. I think we all are pretty much all over that by now. So the first issue tackled by the Court of Appeal is the point that Mr. Justice Nicol completely disregarded the tapes that were clearly in Johnny's favor and basically contained an admission on Amber's part, an admission that she was the perpetrator and not Johnny. So the argument that was posed by both myself in my initial video about the trial judgment and in the appeal arguments presented by Johnny's lawyers is that Mr. Justice Nicol preferred her sworn testimony over contemporaneous evidence simply because it was said under oath. And we've already talked about why that is such a flawed approach. But the Court of Appeal did not agree. They stated that, according to them and their understanding, Mr. Justice Nicol wasn't saying that he wasn't going to assign any significant weight to the tapes simply because they weren't evidence that was given in court under oath. They then go on to refer to paragraph 4 of this judgment, which I will flash up on the screen now, as proof that Mr. Justice Nicol does indeed assign weight to contemporaneous evidence over sworn testimony. And if you look at this paragraph, it exclusively contains evidence in Amber's favor and is therefore adverse to Johnny, which is so confusing to me that they do this, because that is another major problem that was brought to the Court of Appeal's attention with Mr. Justice Nicol's decision-making process. He did indeed acknowledge contemporaneous evidence in favor of Amber, but he only did that in favor of Amber. He never once accepted any external evidence that was in favor of Johnny. And yet the Court of Appeal are using this very fact as proof that he doesn't ignore contemporaneous evidence and he doesn't prefer sworn testimony. Yeah, sure, only if it favors Amber though. As soon as any type of evidence, whether sworn or external or contemporaneous, favors Johnny, he assigns almost no weight to it, right down to the photographic evidence provided by his bodyguards of his bruises, the witness testimony provided by his bodyguards, the text messages, contemporaneous evidence of Johnny telling people to come extract him, to come save him. She's going at it again. He ignored all of that. That's our issue. And the Court of Appeal just completely, it went over their heads. So they go on to say that in their opinion, Mr. Justice Nicol was basically saying that he wasn't going to assign weight to the tapes because of the particular circumstances in which they were made. So they're saying that they were informal conversations taking place between a couple that was clearly at the final stages of their relationship. There was a lot of animosity between them. There wasn't some third party like a psychologist or a counselor to intervene and clarify things. They're also pointing out that just because Amber never contradicted Johnny when he said, "You came at me," that doesn't mean that it was true, because according to them, that would be speculation. They don't want to speculate and see Amber's silence as an admission, but they seem to be comfortable with the notion that both of them may have been physical. So they go on to say that that doesn't necessarily mean that any admission made by Amber, for example, in these conversations should be ignored, but the question of how much weight to be attributed to such evidence is a matter for the trial judge to determine. So they don't want to second guess the judge's conclusion that no great weight was to be attached to these tapes. So again, here they're saying he had the advantage of being at the trial, listening to the testimony, listening to the tapes. I don't know if they've listened to them. I think they may have read the transcript. I'm not sure if they've actually heard the conversations. They did make mention of them in the appeal hearing, by the way. But this is the whole concept of courts of appeal don't want to interfere with findings of fact. They also make mention of a third taped conversation which contains a similar admission by Amber that she was the perpetrator. I'm not sure if this is the tape they're referring to, but I think it's the phone call that Amber and Johnny had after the divorce was initiated. Because I think the two main tapes relied upon were the one that they had in person together before the divorce, and then the San Francisco one in July when the restraining order was already in place. But essentially, again, they're saying, well, it's not crystal clear, it's not a very fair thing to assume that she was admitting to being a perpetrator. Okay, now we get to that mutual guilt that I referred to earlier. They brought this up in the hearing when they started going down the path of, let's say she did do what she admitted to on these tapes. That doesn't mean Johnny didn't do everything that she alleges he did. So one doesn't cancel out the other, you know what I mean? Which is a fair argument to put forward if Amber had solid, crystal clear evidence of Johnny behaving in that way. Yes, she has those photos that were taken in May. But what's more important is the authenticity of these photos was very much put in question based off the several witnesses that have spoken to and interacted with her during that week leading up to her going to court and getting the restraining order. If there were no witnesses in that 1 week, it would be incredibly difficult for Johnny to prove that she was lying. But we have the Eastern Columbia building staff, neighbors, makeup artists. I even forgot how many people. We have so many people now. We have paparazzi photos of her laughing with Raquel a day after going to court with not a single bruise on her face and very clearly makeup free. We have CCTV footage, which I will admit is not clear. It's CCTV footage. It's one of the worst qualities of footage known to mankind. You'd think they'd up the ante in that area, by the way, seeing as it's security footage. But no, it's always the most blurry and awfully colored footage. But I digress. Point being, the legitimacy of, honestly, her only piece of evidence is completely discarded, flushed down the toilet, thrown out the balcony, whatever you want to say, because of all the other evidence that opposes it. And this applies to the December 2015 James Corden interview incident, the one that allegedly took place the day before. And again, we have footage of her. We have testimony from her stylist at the time that she was absolutely fine. There was nothing wrong with her. Even her makeup artist, Melanie Iglesias, didn't really back up her claims because she said, oh yeah, the bruises weren't even that dark. It was really easy to cover. And then there's Amber going, I was bruised AF and my nose was broken and so on and so forth. We have the nurse who said there was nothing wrong with her apart from her scabbed lip. So everyone's supporting Amber who says, oh no, she had plenty of evidence. She may have had evidence, but it was absolutely disputed by much stronger evidence from various sources. Sources that weren't even related to each other. So here in paragraph 17, they talk about how to say that Mr. Justice Nicol accepted her evidence without question is unfair because there was plenty that demonstrated his reliance on the contemporaneous evidence, not necessarily her evidence. They go on to say that he was not uncritical about her evidence, and then they list the Australia incident where he found that she exaggerated and how he excluded certain evidence because it was in relation to incidents that were not specifically pleaded by the defendants. And an example of that is the Bahamas incident in December of 2015. And with regards to this Bahamas incident, there was so much evidence from Tara Roberts, I believe, which really supported Johnny, and it was excluded, again, because it was not a pleaded incident. And Johnny's team submitted that that's not fair because it was such compelling evidence that corroborated Johnny's evidence. But the Court of Appeal rejected that. They didn't find that it was unfair. To them, it demonstrated that Mr. Justice Nicol did in fact recognize that Amber could have misbehaved in a physical manner towards Johnny. But that did not preclude him from finding that Johnny did the same on the other numerous occasions relied on by the defense, which is what we just talked about. They were both at fault. Doesn't mean that NGN defamed Johnny. Now we get to the other point that we briefly talked about during the podcast, the March 2013 incident where Amber and Whitney changed their statements and changed their evidence at the last minute. So initially, Amber said there was the one incident in March which stood out to her because it was that horrific. And then when Johnny's team clearly demonstrated that they had evidence to counter that, she and Whitney went back and said there were multiple incidents, we were just confused. Mr. Justice Nicol accepted that, if you'll remember, and said that she was probably traumatized and it's very understandable that she would be confused. The Court of Appeal backed him up on this. They stated that the fact that there were other incidents earlier in the month is not necessarily inconsistent with Ms. Heard's statement that the incident in question was unlike anything else she had experienced before. That depends on how serious they were. But in any event, errors of that kind are very common when even a truthful witness is recalling evidence which occurred some years previously. And Mr. Justice Nicol was right to accept that she was just confused. There's really nothing to elaborate on here. They, like Mr. Justice Nicol, don't see the inconsistency and the making it up as they go along as a problem. I will say, it is fair to say that even truthful witnesses can forget. We're human and memories fade. But for someone who says it really stands out to me in my mind and it's so clear because it was so horrific, that really then flies in the face of, I don't remember, I'm so confused. You just said that you remember it very clearly because it really stands out in your mind. But then you back up and say, no, I'm confused. Which one is it? I really don't know. Maybe it's because I'm not a judge and I'm not old and wise enough to see things from their perspective. But to me, if someone just keeps changing, especially so late in the process, and there are already multiple holes in their story, tapes, everything that is piled up against Amber, I would highly question the veracity of their claims, especially with the photographic evidence presented by Johnny's team of her on set for the Keith Richards documentary that Johnny was involved in with a perfectly fine face. So it's not even just a matter of she's probably lying. There's photographic evidence that supports that notion. I will say, though, to be fair, there were issues because there were no experts called in to verify the dates on which these photos were taken. So Mr. Justice Nicol did say he didn't want to speculate, which he would have had to since there was no solid evidence of the timestamp and the date stamp. So I get that. I understand that. I'm not siding with Mr. Justice Nicol. I think you all know that by now. I don't even have to say it, but I will point out things when it's fair. So during the hearing, Mr. Caldecott relied on 3 examples because of the time limitations of the hearing. And he picked them as the strongest examples to illustrate how Mr. Justice Nicol just accepted Amber for her word and everything else was irrelevant. For the reasons we just talked about, where they illustrated he did rely on contemporaneous evidence only when it benefited Amber, the Court of Appeal rejected that argument. They focused on the fact that Mr. Justice Nicol's judgment was very detailed, very lengthy. In relation to every incident, he sets out in scrupulous detail the evidence that supported the rival accounts. They found that in relation to each incident, he made it very clear why he reached the conclusion that he does. I mean, he did make it very clear why, but that doesn't make it right. A lot of the time, he made it clear that the reason was because he believed her. And that was the entire problem. Why do you believe her over Johnny and his witnesses? Another ground of appeal was that the judge did not adequately consider the issue of Amber's credibility or lack thereof, which the Court of Appeal disagreed with and said that that's not a fair criticism because, as we just discussed earlier, he did question her credibility as evidenced by not believing her with the Australia hostage incident. I think that was really one of the only incidents he really questioned her credibility on. There was a confidential allegation, that's why it's not on my mind because we can't read it, in relation to, was it Hicksville? I think it was. I'm not too sure. It's all a blur now. It's just so much information. But he did find that a confidential allegation did not happen. So there were 2 incidents that he didn't believe her on. And so the Court of Appeal is saying clearly he didn't just believe everything she had to say. He did call her credibility into question and relied on contemporaneous evidence, external evidence, to arrive at his conclusions, which on the face of it is a very fair point to make, but it just leads to more questions than answers, in my opinion, because it really starts begging the question, why did he not question her credibility then? But they do address this when we talk about the application for fresh evidence, so just bear with me. It's also worth mentioning what the Court of Appeal had to say about the DV police officers and their testimony, specifically with regards to the testimony that was provided by Officer Haddon. He never got to testify because he was never called upon for cross-examination. And of course, that was a strategic move on the part of NGN. They actually insisted that he make himself available for cross-examination, and they still didn't call him because anything he had to say was going to be in Johnny's favor. And so, because of that reason, Mr. Justice Nicol did not consider his hearsay evidence. which is his deposition, because it was an out-of-court statement that is being introduced to prove that a certain fact is true. When a witness is not cross-examined, anything they say outside of court is considered hearsay. And the Court of Appeal found that Mr. Justice Nicol was right to do so. And in any case, they say that Mr. Justice Nicol's problem wasn't the hearsay nature of the evidence, but rather the evidence itself. If you'll remember, he said they made no contemporaneous notes. How can I rely on what they have to say? Even though they were eyewitnesses who directly examined the apartment, the penthouse, and Amber's face multiple times in that one visit. They never addressed that. How can you disregard eyewitness testimony, the most direct form of evidence known to mankind, when a witness visually witnesses something, whatever it may be? They may have not witnessed the actual incident, fair enough, but they saw her face. They saw the state of the apartment. As I talked about in my podcast, they didn't even know who she was. Therefore, they did not know that Johnny Depp was even involved. So any notion of they must be fans, they must be biased, is again immediately just flushed down the toilet. How do you explain not taking into account the evidence of two trained DV police officers simply because they failed to take notes? How can you just leave that up in the air? This appeal is just adding more questions rather than helping resolve them. So in conclusion, they did not believe that the grounds of appeal show that the proposed appeal has any real prospect of success. Now, in the podcast, we talked about how this will have a blast radius that is far wider than Johnny. The implications are going to be wide because this does set precedent. In the future, for future defamation cases in the UK, parties can rely on Depp versus NGN, which is a potential problem. It can open doors to the media, NGN, Associated Newspapers. I don't know what other monster of a company owns tabloids in the UK. They can now rely on this as support for why any future defamation cases brought against them should be dismissed. Now, of course, the facts have to be similar enough. That's how precedent works. You can't just pick some random case that has nothing to do with the facts of your own case and has no issues in common and then rely on it. So there has to be some kind of a link in order to rely on precedent. That's what makes good lawyers. That's what makes being a lawyer so hard. A huge part of our job is to go through the case law and find the cases that best apply to our case and also best work in our favor. All right, now the charity donations. This one I really didn't think would go through even from the very beginning. I even made note in my last video where I talked about the live hearing. If this one fails, then the appeal should go on regardless, because I truly believe that this one would fail, simply because I knew the courts would see this as a marginal issue, as something that doesn't really change anything with regards to the facts of the case. I'm not saying I agree with that, but when I remove myself and view it purely as a lawyer, I remove all of my personal opinions, I can see why that is a valid argument. So just as a refresher, very quickly, the main purpose of introducing this evidence is to prove that Amber is a liar and that she was never a victim, because if she really was, then she would have donated this money to DV shelters as she said she would. But we have to remember that the only mention of the charity donations was really made by Mr. Justice Nicol at the end of his judgment, where he says clearly she's not a gold digger because she states that she has donated the money, which she did state in her witness statement. Other than that, she was never cross-examined on it. And another problem is, unfortunately, Mr. Sherborne actually told Mr. Justice Nicol that it wasn't part of his case that Amber was a gold digger. If you don't plead an argument, then a trial judge is not obliged to consider it. And of course, a court of appeal isn't obliged to consider it. When you want to introduce fresh evidence, it can't just be in relation to something that was never pleaded. Courts are very particular about this, and they had huge issues with Meghan Markle's case as well, by the way. I mean, she ended up winning, but to begin with, the judge in that case had a huge problem with her pleadings because she was bringing up things that were never pleaded officially in her complaint. Oh, Princess Eugenie did this and this other person did that. And she was assigning a lot of blame to people that was never formally pleaded. Courts hate doing that. I believe she even got a cost order for wasting the court's time and not sticking to what was strictly pleaded. I can tell you that courts are sticklers for that. I do question why Mr. Sherborne and his team decided to go down that route. I don't understand why they didn't plead that she was a gold digger. I mean, Johnny's entire complaint was that this was a hoax and it was an insurance policy and she was planning this from the get-go and, wanted to get him and his money. So you think being a gold digger is part of that claim, right? Under the umbrella of the hoax, as we call it. But again, Mr. Sherborne appeared to have expressly told Mr. Justice Nicol that they're not relying on the notion that Amber is a gold digger. So that automatically strikes it out of the list of issues that should be taken into account during the trial. He said that the issue of the hoax and of whether Miss Heard was a gold digger were not connected. I think it's a matter of perspective and subjective understanding of the word hoax, I guess. So it seems like it's a matter that is open to interpretation, and the Court of Appeal decided to go with what Mr. Sherborne expressly said, which is disregard it. We're not relying on that. Which is unfortunate because it's fair for the Court of Appeal to rely on that. Now, in one of my older videos, I honestly don't remember which one at this point, I referred to the Ladd and Marshall common law test, which is the accepted test for deciding whether fresh or new evidence should be adduced during an appeal. So the first limb is if it couldn't have been obtained with reasonable diligence for use at the trial. Secondly, if it would probably have had an important influence on the result. And thirdly, if it is credible. The first issue that the Court of Appeal has is the one that we just talked about, which is the concept of her being a gold digger was irrelevant. And that was reinforced by Mr. Sherborne. They state that the judge accepted that this was not a hoax based on the contemporaneous evidence provided by NGN. And they found that this point, that it's irrelevant, was further reinforced by the fact that Amber was never cross-examined on the issue, which I suppose was a fatal flaw. We talked about this in the last video where I summarized the hearing. Mr. Caldicott said that they didn't want to cross-examine her without solid evidence to contradict her. I think that's a very fair point for Mr. Caldicott to have made, but clearly hindsight is 20/20, and I really, really wish that they would have just cross-examined her on the issue just to highlight that it was indeed an important part of their case. Of course, the other issue is credibility, Amber's credibility specifically. If she lied about this, Johnny's team argues that her entire credibility should be called into question. I mean, I don't think we had to wait for the charity evidence to come out to question her credibility. We had plenty to question it prior, but this is just one more thing that can be added to prove that this person is not to be trusted. And I've talked a lot about the importance of a witness's credibility when it comes to defamation cases. Hopefully, in Virginia, because she is the defendant, she's not just a witness, her credibility will be a lot more important. So a lot more weight will be attributed to it because she's relying on the defense of truth. Truth and credibility are inextricably intertwined. You cannot have one without the other. If someone is not credible, if someone is lying, then they are not saying the truth. And therefore, that defense should fail. So I'm really hoping that the judge makes it very clear to the jury in Virginia that the defense of truth inherently depends on her credibility. So in response to this, of course, as you can probably guess by now, the Court of Appeal rejected this argument as well. They stated that he didn't even refer to her charitable donation at all in the context of his central findings. He only mentions it in a very particular context with regards to his rebuttal, essentially, of Johnny's argument that she's a gold digger. Then they go on to repeat that Mr. Justice Nicol clearly relied on contemporaneous evidence beyond Amber's testimony. So they state that based on that approach, there was little need or room for the judge to give weight to any general assessment of Miss Heard's credibility. It is pure speculation and, in their view, very unlikely that he gave any weight to general considerations about her character of the kind suggested by Mr. Caldecott. And what Mr. Caldecott is referring to with regards to an assessment of her character is when Mr. Justice Nichols said, donating to charity is such a noble thing to do, and clearly not something a gold digger would do. Court of Appeal found that that has nothing to do with anything, and her credibility didn't even really matter because of the extent of the contemporaneous evidence that existed in support of NGN's allegations. Like I stated earlier, this just leaves me feeling more confused. The more I read this, the further I go on, the more confused I get. How can they say that her credibility had nothing to do with Mr. Justice Nichols' eventual assessment, his final decision, when he said time and time again, she is giving me this evidence under sworn testimony. She is giving it under oath. And therefore, I am going to assign credibility to it. So how can they then turn around and say he didn't even really have to rely on her credibility because of the existence of all of this external supporting evidence? Now, my issue isn't the fact that he relied on this contemporaneous evidence. My issue is the fact that they're disregarding the weight that he did place on her credibility. If he expressly stated that she's not someone very credible, but it doesn't matter, I have enough evidence to make up my mind, I don't need to rely on her credibility. That's not what Mr. Justice Nichols said, and it would be fair if he said that. If the evidence was so strong against Johnny, the contemporaneous external evidence, for example, recordings of Johnny admitting to, being the perpetrator, eyewitness testimony of Johnny being the perpetrator. Basically, imagine that all the evidence that Johnny has against Amber, imagine Amber had that against Johnny. In that situation, I can understand why this notion of her credibility doesn't matter. I have the evidence. But that's not the approach that was taken by Mr. Justice Nichols. He made it clear that he assigned weight to her testimony and therefore her credibility. I'm just so confused about how the Court of Appeal could say that at the end of the day, it was quite clear he didn't rely on her credibility. He relied on the external evidence. I don't understand how they could have arrived at that. Make it make sense. They go on to say that for the same reasons we just talked about, they do not believe that the evidence would have at all changed Mr. Justice Nichols' approach to the evidence before him and to his final decision. So essentially, if this evidence was even available during trial, it wouldn't have changed anything because it's irrelevant. Her failure to donate to them has nothing to do with whether Johnny committed the wrongdoing that she is accusing him of committing. Now, this argument, specifically viewed in isolation, it's a fair argument to make. Her lying about not donating the money doesn't mean that she was not a victim. We've talked about this before in relation to other witnesses, for example, the car mechanic who gave evidence about her character and about how apparently she and her father were, behaving quite badly towards him. That, according to Mr. Justice Nichols, didn't have any bearing on whether her allegations against Johnny are substantially true. I can see how it's difficult for the audience to see how they're not related. But from a legal perspective, strictly, I can see how one doesn't necessarily have a lot of impact on the other. To me, the main relevance is credibility. But for the reasons we just discussed, the Court of Appeal found that credibility is a marginal issue. And it doesn't really have anything to do with the way Mr. Justice Nichols approached his decision. Finally, they make mention that the fact that she wasn't cross-examined would make it unfair and essentially wrong to allow Johnny to introduce this evidence. It wasn't something that was brought up during the trial. It wasn't something that was put to her. So the court doesn't see it as right and fair to now allow this evidence to be adduced, which, again, seen in isolation, strictly from a legal standpoint, very fair argument to make. It was a fatal flaw, as I said, to not cross-examine her and officially put it on the record that they are accusing her of lying about these donations. And now to answer the most common question that I've been receiving in the comment section of my podcast, which is, can Johnny appeal this to an even higher court? The answer is no. And that's not because a higher court doesn't exist. It does in the form of the Supreme Court. However, there are restrictions on the types of appeals that can be made to the Supreme Court. And Johnny's case, unfortunately, falls under one of the many restricted instances, which is appealing the Court of Appeals decision to refuse to grant permission to appeal the decision made by a lower court, which is the High Court in this instance. So unfortunately, this is the end of the line for Johnny in the UK. I think rather than focusing on this negative, Johnny, which I'm sure he's already doing, needs to focus his energy and attention to Virginia and learn from this process, learn from this failure. If we don't fail, we don't learn. So now hopefully all of the weaknesses identified during this process in the UK can be addressed before it's too late in Virginia. For example, questioning her on the charity donations. Now, of course, they're going to question her because they have solid evidence that she never donated. But it's just an example of the many things that could have been done better in the UK. Another thing to remember is that Virginia will be a jury trial. So the decision won't be in the hands of one judge. Let's just hope the jury can recognize that male victims do exist and female perpetrators do exist. That's it for this video. I hope you found it informative. Everything is linked down below. I always link to Nick Wallace's website because that is the ultimate source for all of the documents that I refer to in Johnny's case in the UK. I'd like to thank you all again for the support I've received on the podcast so far. It's brand new, and I hope to see more of you watching because just naturally, inevitably, even if you can't see it in the title, a lot of these issues will be brought up and discussed. It's such an integral part of not just my channel, honestly, but my everyday views and opinions and my beliefs. I wholeheartedly believe in Johnny's battle. If you do have suggestions for future topics for my podcast, please let me know. Eventually, I'm going to run out. I really want to talk about Meghan Markle and the Oprah interview because if you've watched me in the podcast, you'll know that I have changed my mind about her. I did a lot of research in preparation for the first episode of my podcast because I was going to talk about her before Johnny's appeal decision was released. I didn't know it was going to be released that soon. And unfortunately, I did uncover a lot of things that portray her in a really negative light in my mind now. But I'll elaborate on that more in a podcast episode. As always, don't forget to let me know what you think in the comments below. If you haven't subscribed, then please do so. And I've also been hearing that a lot of you don't get notifications when I post a new video. So I think the solution I heard some people say is you need to unclick the bell notifications and just click it again to refresh it and remind YouTube that you want to be notified. Other than that, you can also follow me on Twitter. I'm back there in a very limited capacity. I share my videos. Sometimes I share a few tweets, updates, but I don't really interact anymore because that was the main reason I had to leave Twitter. It was just so overwhelming. A few people, I'm sure they meant well, but they were very demanding and would get very angry if I didn't respond to literally hundreds of questions every single day, and it almost drove me insane. So if you notice that you can't respond to my tweets, that's why. I hope you don't take offense to that. It's a harmony that I came up with where I can be on Twitter and not want to run away. Thank you all so much for watching. A very special and warm thank you to my patrons. Stay safe, everyone, and I will catch you in a future video.